Canada is the second largest country on Earth, and with a population of just over 35 million in 2016, according to Statistics Canada, it is also among the least densely populated ones. For some, those two facts alone would raise the question why anyone would want to cycle across its entire length from west to east, while for others, like myself, it's enough reason to wonder if such a tour is possible. How long would it take? How many miles or kilometers would it be in total? Would there be enough places to camp along the way without having to pay a fortune? What about food and water? Hello and welcome everyone. I am George Schlacek.
The one and only.
I had been thinking about a bicycle tour across Canada ever since I had discovered bicycle touring. It had sat there on my bucket list for years, among a few other dreams of that sort. Then, Canada's 150th anniversary came near, which also happened to be my personal anniversary of having lived in this country for 30 years. So far, all I've listed here are statistical facts, numbers that may or may not be meaningful. As a guy who never cared much about numbers of any kind, there certainly had to be other reasons. But the way it all came together sure made up a nice excuse for an epic tour. As I was getting serious in my planning, I also found out that the idea wasn't really that unique. Several people I knew or someone they knew had already done it. It turned out that it would take about 3 months for a seasoned cyclist, and worth every minute, so they said. Someone even gave me a DVD they had put together after recording much of their trip. All this made me want to do it even more. It doesn't take much to get me excited about a bicycle tour, and the longer it is, the better. When you match the assumed time frame of 3 months with the distance from the west coast to the east coast, it can seem overwhelming, and indeed it is more distance than I had ever covered in such a period. Several years before, I had cycled around the Gulf of Mexico without any route planning. The tour is documented in my book Destinations Are Fake, and the playlist by that title here on this channel. It had taken almost 6 months, and the total distance covered was probably still shy of the 8,000 or so kilometers it would take to get across Canada. In 2013, I had taken off for 3 months to get across Central America, and it had barely been enough time. In the case of Canada, riding in excess of 100 kilometers a day was simply a requirement. I didn't have to worry about covering that kind of distance on any of my prior tours, at least not in the same way. The emphasis had always been on exploring places, not meeting a cycling challenge. The bicycle was just my vehicle of choice, the only one that would allow me to move truly on my own pace and, of course, on my own power. This bicycle was still the same one, a mid-1980s Norco Sasquatch mountain bike with some modifications. It had received a complete overhaul after the Central America tour, including a not-so-great paint job. New additions were a better stem because the old one had broken inside the headset, probably from rough roads in Costa Rica and Panama, a Brooks B17 leather seat, and kind of last minute, a bike computer. I like to call it the kilometer thing. That wasn't even my idea, but my mom said I shouldn't go on a big tour without one, so I complied. 3 months for a cross-Canada bike tour seemed short to me, but it was the time I was comfortable committing to such an undertaking. Climate is also a factor in this country, as summer is short in many places I would have to cross. Quite frankly, I wasn't up for cycling thousands of kilometers in sub-zero temperatures with snow and ice adding to the challenge. Then, taking 3 months out of a potentially busy work schedule means a significant sacrifice. Often people tell me how they wished they could afford to go on a 3-month trip, or how they would plan the cross-Canada tour for their retirement, which in many cases is decades away. What I usually tell them is that they can absolutely afford to go on a big bicycle tour. The reality is that most people choose to postpone it until there's no sacrifice, like when they are millionaires or get regular pay without having to work for it. Often those same people owe thousands on a late model car, or they live in a home that costs them a small fortune in mortgage payments each month for decades. They may have businesses that would suffer from a months-long absence or other types of commitments that simply don't allow for extended breaks. The question, however, is not whether they can afford to go on tour, but rather how much they are willing to sacrifice for it. Simply put, how badly do you really want to go? Where are your priorities? There's nothing wrong with bicycle touring after you retire, but not everyone is lucky enough to be healthy and motivated enough at an advanced age. It makes sense to sacrifice somewhere in order to do some touring. I am the type who likes to explore. Earlier in life, it has led me to travel across Canada by car. Then later, I abandoned a career as a forklift technician in order to get paid for travel as a trucker. You might as well say that my curiosity about discovering new and unique places is the true reason I love touring by bicycle. Not just the physical challenge of getting from A to B on my own power, even though I love that feeling and won't shy away from it. In the spirit of destinations are fake, Canada is hardly a destination, especially not if you're already there. The idea was to go beyond what a typical cross-Canada trip in a vehicle would look like. 8,000 or so kilometers was just a number that allowed me to allocate a time frame for the project, without abandoning my urban life in Edmonton entirely. While I knew that I had to work my way through the country 1 kilometer at a time, sometimes uphill and against the wind, it seemed more important what was between the kilometers. Were there places in Canada I could fall in love with that I haven't even heard of? What about the population? Who was living on reserves and in those villages that had only 100 people or less? What are Canada's roads like outside of the big urban centers and away from the busy main highways? Was it even possible to travel across the country on secondary roads? What about the famous Great Trail that is being promoted as the longest recreational trail in the world? Was this trail actually fully connected as promoted by the website under that name? There were so many unknowns. Even after having lived in Canada for 30 years, I knew very little of it. Most Canadians are like that. They may have lived in different provinces and cities far apart and yet very similar. Every Canadian city and suburbs have the same kind of infrastructure, with the same big box stores and chain restaurants. You could pretty much walk into any Canadian city and know its basic pattern. Except that this isn't really Canada. It's just where the majority of Canadians live. A bicycle tour would inevitably lead through cities and suburbs like that, but the majority of the time and distance would be covered in remote areas, roughly following major highways, but on the lesser traveled roads wherever possible. Originally, I had the idea of attempting to ride the entire length of the Trans-Canada Trail from west to east. But when I contacted the Public Relations Department of the Great Trail, I was told that parts of the trail were on water, rivers and lakes. To me, that didn't match the definition of a trail at all. But it seems that most Canadians are not aware of that situation, and therefore the way the trail is being promoted doesn't seem to bother anyone. What else are Canadians in the metropolitan areas unaware of? Was there something a cross-country bike tour could reveal that was worth sharing or even important to raise awareness about? Would 3 months be long enough to get a good idea of what that something might be? This leads me to the question of cycling infrastructure. Was it safe to cycle in Canada outside of the city parks with their multi-use trails and the city streets with recently added bike lanes that are often nothing more than a painted line on the road? In my experience, Canadians generally drive cars and pickup trucks to the point of obsession. And it is understandable because distances are long and public transportation is non-existent. Sure, you can fly across the country and there's even a Via Rail train, but the majority of goods and passengers moves along the Trans-Canada Highway in cars and trucks. Bicycles are not given much consideration. Would there be a safe place to ride a bike on Canadian roads where there were no trails? Not so long ago, the Trans-Canada Highway was being celebrated as a major achievement. It is one of the longest roads in the world. The accessibility of most places in Canada by motorized vehicles is often taken for granted, but roads are few in remote areas, and there are still places where people live that can't be reached that way. Fact is that the number of cars in Canada has increased dramatically over the past several decades. Infrastructure has been added and upgraded, but not at the same rate. Simply put, there were more and more cars on a limited number of roads, and for a cyclist, this always means increased risk. More cars isn't a sign of progress. It's more like an indication of a poor transportation strategy. In November of 2016, I made headlines in Edmonton for vowing to fight a traffic ticket I got for riding my bicycle on a sidewalk in an area where a safe alternative wasn't available. The court proceedings for this would have lasted beyond July of 2017, which is why I decided to abandon the fight in favor of going on this bicycle tour. I remain committed to advocating for safe cycling infrastructure and would like to see it expanded beyond urban centers. In my view, bicycles have the potential to become a major part of our transportation system, not only in cities. Nothing makes you appreciate long distances more than cycling, 1 kilometer at a time. But it is also surprisingly easy to cover long distances that way, as long as you change your perspective on time. When you ask a Canadian how far a certain town is from where they live, chances are they'll answer in hours and minutes, not kilometers. This number always refers to the time it takes by car. No one knows how far it really is or how long it would take by bike. While my tour wasn't unique, I was hopeful that it could ultimately contribute to a growing demand for a trail network that truly spans the country and ultimately the world. Of course, there was also the question about what gear to take along. I had bought a new tent and a sleeping bag that was good for -6 Celsius. This might seem like overkill for a summer trip, but in hindsight, it was absolutely necessary. In Canada, temperatures bounce around between two extremes, and overall, it is simply unpredictable what lies ahead. I was planning to save money on meals, so a stove was necessary too. My prior experience, as well as my tight budget, kind of made me go the same route as I had done on my very first tour. I bought a couple of canned Australian beers, drank them, and then made a stove out of them, out of the cans. There are some very good instructions for this on other channels. I think this one's the one I used. I still use the same stove even today. For the very first time, I was also committed to recording much of my journey and therefore needed cameras. I went with a relatively inexpensive SJ4000, a Canon ELPH, and a Nikon Coolpix. This tour was my first one ever to be documented on YouTube, with actual video footage. The playlist, Destination Canada 150, pretty much takes you through the adventure. What's missing from it are the stories that happened along the way, which is why I'm making new videos about the tour now. As you can tell, I was intent on doing this tour on a small budget and sharing the experience. You don't have to spend $3,000 on equipment before you can do an epic bike tour. Many would-be cycle tourists shy away from the activity because they perceive a need for expensive equipment. Modern touring bikes are nice, but most available models cost upwards of $1,500. Throw in some gear and a few tools, and you easily have an entry barrier to the activity of over $3,000. Often the cycling and outdoor retailers end up winning here, as people go out and blow their budget on the equipment they think they need, leaving little or nothing to go on a meaningful tour. Can you have your cake and eat it too? Well, you already know that it's possible. The question is it advisable? In my next video, I'll take you through the first days of my tour, starting at my doorstep in Edmonton, where I was picked up by an airport taxi on May 17th of 2017 to board a plane to Vancouver. My bike was in a box, and it would stay that way until I arrived in Tofino, on the shore of the Pacific Ocean, to start my ride. I'll never forget that journey, as it took the better part of 2 days and left me stranded with no place to spend the night for the first time that summer. This was going to be the norm. 3 months of living outdoors as much as possible in locations that were unknown to me and hopefully reasonably safe. I hope you'll join me for the continuation of this series. Why not subscribe right now? Deal. See you next week. But wait, I have a ton of content you might actually enjoy. Across Canada wasn't my first major tour. Here are some other videos.